Welcome to The Explainer. We're jumping right into a really fascinating clash today, a collision between a strict local anti-obscenity ordinance and the absolute bedrock constitutional protections of free speech. Imagine you're publishing a magazine, right? And suddenly, out of nowhere, you find yourself staring down criminal charges under a sweeping local law that literally bans the mere depiction of a nude human body. Where exactly is the line drawn between a government protecting community morals and a government outright censoring legitimate expression? Well, we are going to unpack the mechanics of a landmark legal battle that forces us to ask exactly that.
Okay, let's dive into this roadmap. We're going to cover the magazine and the law, defining obscenity with the Miller test, the incredibly tricky question of mootness, the Supreme Court majority's use of judicial restraint, and finally, the dissent's warnings about chilling effects.
Section 1. The magazine and the law. So, the inciting incident of this whole legal saga involves the publishers and editors of FHM Philippines, specifically Alan Madrilejos, Lisa Gokongwei Cheng, and their editorial team. They ended up squarely in the legal crosshairs when a group of pastors and preachers filed a criminal complaint against them. And we aren't just talking about a slap on the wrist here. They were facing serious potential jail time and fines under a specific local law in the city of Manila for allegedly publishing scandalous and obscene materials. To really grasp the weight of this, check out this timeline. Manila Ordinance number 7780 was enacted way back in 1993. It just sat there on the books for 15 years before these publishers were suddenly criminally charged under it in 2008. And those charges, they hovered over the editors for 5 whole years, threatening their livelihoods and their actual freedom until the prosecutor's office finally dismissed them in 2013. But during that stressful half-decade, the publishers didn't just sit back. They fought back, taking their battle all the way to the Supreme Court to challenge the very existence of the ordinance itself.
You might be wondering, why go after the law itself? Well, because of how incredibly broad its language was. Under Manila Ordinance 7780, it was a straight-up crime to print, distribute, or sell materials depicting sexual acts, completely nude human bodies or human sexual organs and female breasts. And here's the absolute kicker. The ordinance explicitly stated that this applied regardless of the motive of the publisher, author, or artist. Sure, there was a tiny, narrow exception for scientific or medically related art, but otherwise, the ban was absolute. So theoretically, under the strict text of this law, a medical student carrying a biology textbook or an art lover holding a print of a classic Renaissance painting could be treated exactly like a smuggler of illegal contraband. Crazy, right? So, the crucial point is that the publishers argued this law was unconstitutional, based on something called the overbreadth doctrine. To put it simply, this legal principle says that even if a government has a perfectly legitimate reason to regulate something, like, say, actual obscenity, it cannot do so using laws that sweep unnecessarily broadly and accidentally end up criminalizing perfectly legal, constitutionally protected speech. The publishers made the case that by banning literally any depiction of nudity without looking at the context, the city of Manila was illegally invading the protected realm of artistic and literary expression. Which brings us to Section 2, defining obscenity and the Miller test. To really understand why the publishers thought the Manila Ordinance went way too far, we have to look at how courts actually separate unprotected obscenity from protected expression, because it's not just about whether someone happens to find an image offensive. Courts rely on a very famous legal benchmark called the Miller test, which originally came from the U.S. Supreme Court but was adopted into local jurisprudence. For a work to be deemed legally obscene, it has to fail 3 very specific steps. First, an average person applying contemporary community standards has to find that the work, taken as a whole, appeals to the prurient interest, basically meaning an excessive, shameful focus on sexual desires. Second, it has to depict sexual conduct in a patently offensive way. And third, and this is arguably the most important part, the work taken as a whole must lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. You can't just isolate one single provocative image. You have to evaluate the entire context of the work.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the massive procedural twist that happened right in the middle of all this. While the Supreme Court was reviewing this exact constitutional challenge, in 2013, the prosecutor actually dismissed the criminal charges against the FHN publishers, which forces a pretty critical legal question. If the publishers are no longer facing jail time under the ordinance, is there actually still a case for the Supreme Court to decide?
This leads right into Section 3, the question of mootness. Is the case still alive? This dismissal created a huge legal roadblock. The Supreme Court was suddenly split on whether they even still had the jurisdiction or the right to strike down the Manila Ordinance. The core concept here is whether the case had become moot and academic. Let's de-jargonize that for a second.
In law, courts generally really don't like to rule on hypothetical problems. If the actual, real-world threat of jail time has completely vanished because the charges were dropped, making a ruling might have zero practical legal value. It essentially ceases to be an active controversy. Now, the publishers argued, hey, the case is not moot because the law is still on the books. We could literally be charged again next month. But the court had to weigh that very real fear against some incredibly strict procedural rules.
And this procedural hurdle resulted in a highly debated, deeply divided decision. As we can see, the Supreme Court ultimately voted 9-4 to dismiss the petition. 9 justices believed the case was legally moot and shouldn't be ruled upon, while 4 justices strongly dissented, arguing the court had an absolute duty to strike the law down right then and there. Let's impartially break down both sides of this fascinating divide.
Moving to Section 4, the majority's judicial restraint.
The 9 justices who voted to dismiss the case relied heavily on a philosophy of strict judicial boundaries. They weren't necessarily endorsing the Manila Ordinance or saying it was a great law, but they fundamentally believed the court wasn't in the proper position to strike it down. The majority's philosophy is perfectly captured in this quote referencing the principle of becoming modesty. The idea here is that the Supreme Court is the ultimate final arbiter of the Constitution, and striking down a law passed by an elected legislative body is a massive, heavy use of power. So if a controversy can be settled on other grounds, like, say, the fact that the criminal charges against the publishers were already dropped, the court should exercise restraint and avoid forcing a massive constitutional showdown unnecessarily. And this brilliantly illustrates the majority's core rationale. First, they concluded that because the charges were dropped, the immediate threat was gone, making the case officially moot. They also pointed out there was no concrete proof the publishers would ever actually be charged again. Second, they argued that the overbreadth doctrine is generally supposed to be used for free speech cases, not to test the validity of penal or criminal laws. And finally, because obscenity is legally considered unprotected speech with no transcendent value to society, they decided a criminal anti-obscenity law shouldn't just be facially invalidated, meaning struck down completely just by looking at the text on the page, without a full-blown trial where all parties, including the city council, could present actual evidence.
Which brings us to our final stop, Section 5, Chilling Effects and the Dissenting View.
On the other side of the bench, 4 justices fiercely disagreed. They argued that leaving Ordinance 7780 on the books, even if these specific publishers had their charges dropped, was a grave and present danger to average citizens and protected expression. The dissenting justices warned of serious government overreach. They argued that the state steps way out of bounds when it tries to strictly dictate community morals without any room for nuance. As Justice Leonen noted in this really powerful dissenting opinion, while the state obviously has a role in public welfare, forcing a rigid, predetermined standard of morality onto citizens ignores the reality that adults have the autonomy to make their own moral choices. They argued that the law has to evolve, and this specific ordinance was essentially a blunt instrument trying to control individual thought.
Let's move to and see how this builds when we directly compare the 2 standards side by side. The tension really spikes here. The dissent pointed out the glaring contradictions between the universally accepted constitutional standard, the Miller test, and Ordinance 7780. Remember, the Miller test requires you to look at a work as a whole, and it completely protects it if it has serious artistic or literary value. But the Manila Ordinance, it punished the mere depiction of nudity regardless of the author's motive. Under the ordinance, the intent of the artist didn't matter at all. The context didn't matter, it was just a blanket ban.
To really hammer home how dangerous this overbreadth is, the dissent zoomed out to look at the real-world impact. Under the strict, unyielding text of Ordinance 7780, an average resident living in Manila who casually displays a classic nude painting or a Renaissance sculpture in their own private living room could, theoretically, face criminal liability and actual jail time. The dissent argued that having a law like this creates a massive chilling effect. Even if the government isn't actively kicking down doors and throwing every art collector in jail, just the mere existence of the law scares people into silence. It deters publishers, artists, and everyday citizens from exercising their constitutional rights out of fear.
So this entire case leaves us standing at a really fascinating intersection of rigid procedural rules and our most fundamental freedoms. The majority chose restraint, respecting the traditional boundaries of the courts when immediate threats fade away. The dissent demanded action, warning us that broad, sweeping laws silently suffocate expression. So, as you think about how laws are drafted and enforced in your own community, consider this. In the delicate balance between regulating public morals and protecting free speech, who exactly gets to decide what has serious artistic value? And what is the ultimate cost to our society when we allow laws to just silence it? Thank you for joining me on The Explainer today. Keep questioning and keep learning.